Welcome to JLive. I'm Laura Mandel, JART's Executive Director, and it's great to be with you for JLive, our virtual series of bite-sized conversations about Jewish life and art with the best artists with Boston connections. Today, I feel very lucky to be with writer and storyteller Judah Leblang, whose first book, Echoes of Jerry, which actually took 10 years to write, was recently published. So welcome, Judah.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
So if you have questions during our conversation, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we will answer as many of them as time allows. So because Judah really is a storyteller and a performance artist of sorts, let's start with a clip so that we can get a sense of who you are.
Sounds good.
Great.
Morning 5 years ago, at the end of a long winter, I answered the phone and had to switch the receiver to my right ear. My left felt plugged up as if I were on a plane. Weeks and then months went by while I waited for things to return to normal, which they never did. So eventually I made an appointment with an ear, nose, and throat specialist who gave me a hearing test. Sitting in a soundproof glass booth, I raised my hands in response to a series of beeping tones. But there were long periods of silence while I struggled to hear those faint beeps. The irony of all this wasn't lost on me. You see, 25 years earlier, I'd earned my undergraduate degree in deaf education. I taught deaf children, and then later worked as a sign language interpreter. Growing up, I felt a strong connection with my Uncle Jerry, who was deaf from birth. Now I understand that it was because we were both different. Jerry visibly, while I felt like an outsider on the inside. But unlike my uncle, I could almost pass for normal. As a boy, I looked up to Jerry, who was full of stories about his exploits as the only deaf kid on the Cleveland Heights High School basketball team.
I played guard. Only deaf kid in the whole league.
But at home, Jerry's father, my grandfather, who we call Papa Ben, would speak to Jerry, a 40-year-old man, as if he were a boy. How many times have I told you? I've explained all this before. Why do I have to explain everything to you over and over again? Much later, I realized that Jerry probably did miss a lot of what Papa said. You see, my grandfather wore a mustache, which made lip reading almost impossible.
So I just think that clip speaks to so much of who you are based on everything we've talked about. So tell us a little bit about what we just saw.
So that was actually a clip from my first show, which is called One Man's Journey Through the Middle Ages. And that was the first time that I really did the show, the full show in front of a live audience. I was petrified, to be honest. And that was early in my performance. And the piece I was doing, a lot of the show was humorous about, getting older and dealing with, things where man planned and God laughed, stuff that happens in middle age. But that piece was about suddenly losing about half of my hearing, which happened about 15 years ago. And again, the irony of the fact that I had worked with deaf kids, taught deaf kids in my first career in my 20s, and later worked as a sign language interpreter in my late 30s. And then I got out of it. And then years later, I ended up losing, quite a bit of my own hearing. And again, my only uncle growing up was deaf. I didn't learn to sign through him, but I had this sense of connection. And that ended up becoming the impetus for the book, which I'll talk about later, which is actually my second book. My first book, which is called Finding My Place, came out shortly before I did this show. But in both of the books, I had some pieces about my uncle and those experiences. But yeah, it was all part of this, where I get my material is really from real life and those things that happen that I didn't necessarily order from the catalog, And
Well, and I love how you said at one point, that you sort of do the mix between the humor and the serious stuff, because really this is about storytelling. This, it's the clean jokes because it's about reality.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times things that happen in reality, and sometimes things that maybe weren't funny at the time, in looking back, I can see the humor, which helps, I think, helps one get through life and put things in perspective. And I think part of getting older is dealing with losses or the realization that not all things are possible, that some dreams won't come true, that we all have a limited amount of time here, and to make the most of it. So that's kind of the theme of my current show. And I incorporated this piece about my uncle in the show, but it's called It's Now or Never, My Life in the Late Middle Ages. And yeah, it's really about that idea, like, okay, if I want to write, if I want to tell stories, if I want to do something, this is it. This is not a dress rehearsal, and to do it now. And I hope that that's a positive message that other people will take away from the show, that yes, there are losses. Yes, aging is challenging, but at the same time, it can also be a wake-up call that if there's things that we really want to do, seize the moment and give it a shot.
I love that. And just so everyone knows, I put information for the show Judah just mentioned in the chat if you're interested in checking that out later in the summer. So when you're talking about all of this, and especially the way you use humor and comedy in life, it's so Jewish. It is so Jewish to see everything in life through the lens of this humor and joy, even when things are hard. So tell us a little bit about your Jewish identity and background and how that informs your work.
Yeah, well, I think as I had mentioned to you before, I grew up in basically a Midwestern Jewish town. I grew up in a suburb of Cleveland. And I think the way I see the world is influenced both by the Jewish world that I grew up in and the Cleveland world that I grew up in, because they're both kind of heavily underdog oriented, I would say. I'm a big Cleveland sports fan. In fact, I was at the Indians game last night. They lost 9 in a row, and they were about to lose last night, and they won in the bottom of the 9th. So I actually got to see them win a game. But I've had many years of kind of, going with this underdog, city, coming from this place that when I was growing up, I was hearing about the glory days of the city, say in the 40s during my parents' time. And my sense was I had always been born too late and missed a lot of the highlights, like when the Indians won the World Series, when the city was growing rather than shrinking, before the riots, things like that. I think in terms of my Jewish identity, it was interesting because where I grew up, we were in the majority. The city, the suburb was probably, I don't know, 75, 80% Jewish. My public high school was, I'd say, at least 80% Jewish. Wow. And yet often I felt like I didn't totally fit in for, maybe other reasons. But I definitely got a sense of being part of a tribe, being part of a culture. My family wasn't extremely observant. I would say they were very reform, but we did the biggies, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Passover, things like that. So I felt like I was grounded in that. And the humor, I think that there were definitely ups and downs in my family and some tragedies. But like my father, for one, had a very good sense of humor. I remember one time when I was a kid, I was over at my grandparents, and I was watching some old movie, kind of like Beach Blanket Bingo, but the British version. So it was like a grade D British beach movie. And my father said, "What are you watching?" And I said, "Oh, this is some English release." And my father said, "This movie wasn't released, it escaped." And that was very much his humor. It was in the moment. It was situational. It was kind of like someone like Johnny Carson, who would just respond in the moment. And that is part of the humor that I think I really appreciate. And I think part of Jewish humor also often comes from difficult experiences and kind of making lemonade from lemons, because obviously the history of our people was challenging, I would say, and not all situations could be made funny, nor should they. But I do think that finding humor where you can is a way of working through some of the challenges and difficulties that we all face. And I think certainly after the last year and a half with the pandemic, on top of whatever other challenges we've been dealing with, there's definitely a place for humor. So yeah, I would say in my show that I try to blend them. And so the humor really comes out of real situations from my life. And there's also some pathos and some more heartfelt and difficult moments. And the piece about my uncle is really not humorous. But again, I think there's places for humor to balance things out and kind of leaven the difficulties. And there's other times where maybe that's not appropriate. So I try to find that balance,
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really special talent to be able to balance and still make us laugh and feel emotion.
Right.
So, okay, so speaking of your uncle, let's talk a little bit more about this book, Echoes of Jerry. And I love that you said working with him and signing is actually what pushed you to write. So tell us more about the book. And you said it took 10 years to write. Tell us what that was like.
Well, yeah, I mean, the book came out of my own life. And in the book, I write about my own coming out process. I didn't come out until I was in my late 20s. When I was living in Columbus, Ohio, that's where I started. And after about a year and a half, I moved to Boston to go to graduate school. That was in the mid 80s, which was early on in the AIDS crisis. And it was a scary time to come out. It was a difficult time. And it was also a time when it wasn't easy to be, out in the world. There was a lot more discrimination and ignorance, I think, than there are now. We still have a ways to go, but I think that in terms of LGBT issues, we've come a ways from 30 years ago. I was also teaching at the Ohio School for the Deaf at that time. I had been teaching deaf kids for 7 or 8 years after graduating from college, and so those, I was kind of going between those two worlds, the deaf world and it's starting to come out, into the gay community. So I write about those things. I started working on the book around the age of 50, which was right around the time that I suddenly lost most of the hearing in my left ear. So that became kind of a trigger for me. I wasn't working with deaf people by that point, but I had done 2 stints as a teacher and an interpreter. There were 2 different times that I worked with deaf people for a total of about 15 years. And then, of course, after I got out of it and losing my own hearing, it made me think about what led me, I think, to work with deaf people in the first place, which was the connection I had with my uncle. And my uncle Jerry, I never saw him sign. I write about this in the book. He had been raised orally, so he had been taught to speak, but he didn't really have normal speech because he didn't have any hearing. And he really, I think, lived between 2 worlds, not really fully in the deaf community, and he also never could really be a hearing person. So he was kind of in no man's land, and I think in my life, I've often felt that way too, kind of, I'm pretty out in my life, but just for various other reasons, I've often felt like I don't quite fit in any particular group. And so this was this affinity that I felt with my uncle growing up. And I'm not giving away too much when I would say that there was a major loss in my life when he passed away. I was just before I graduated from high school. Jerry died of a heart attack, and that's revealed kind of at the beginning of the book. So a lot of writing this was going back and trying to kind of figure out who he was, look at how he influenced my life, and looking at the parallels between his life and my life. And that was, it took me a long time to really find the story and put it together in a way that I thought would really work as a story.
Wow. Well, and I think it's interesting that you said to me, and as we were talking about this, that there are a lot of gay people who work within the deaf community, which I had never known. I think that's really interesting. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think that this kind of intuitive connection I had, or instinctive connection I had with my uncle, was again looking back based on the fact that we were both different, that we were both kind of outsiders in a family. And when I was working in Columbus, and also even more when I was working as a sign language interpreter in Boston, I found that many of the interpreters who work with deaf people were gay or bi, and also there are a lot of gay deaf people. And I realized that a lot of gay people, I think, do feel this affinity with deaf people and vice versa, because 90% of deaf children are born into hearing families, and most gay people, grow up with straight parents and have to find their community outside of the people around them. And that's true for most deaf people. If they're going to connect with the deaf community, it's at school or the deaf club or through various organizations, so they can connect with people who also use American Sign Language and communicate with them freely. So that's really kind of unique compared to other groups. If you grow up Jewish, or you're Black, or you're, say, Mexican American, the people around you are members of that community as well.
Yeah.
But if you grow up gay, if you grow up, most deaf kids experience this feeling, I think, of otherness. And I think there's this profound understanding then that can result between people like me and people like my uncle, because we know what it means to kind of have to find our community or not outside of our families. Yeah, and then I tell that story in the book, but it's more revealed through the actual story of my life and his life. Rather, it's not a lecture on, deaf culture or gay culture. I think it's just something that folks may find interesting that comes out through the story.
Wow. And just so everyone knows, to remind everyone, the book is called Echoes of Jerry, and we'll make sure you have the link to buy it should you be interested, because it's a really, really beautiful story. And it's interesting because you're speaking so much about empathy. And I think it's fascinating that you also said that, as a writer, you also teach, but that you feel like you don't really teach, you facilitate. And I feel like that's really, it's really about the empathy you're talking about. But tell us more about that. What does it mean to you to facilitate versus teach?
Yeah, I don't know if it's really possible to teach creative writing. I think that a lot of the writing process for somebody who is trying to do something, I think it's different if I could potentially coach someone on developing a admission essay, say a college essay, or an argumentative essay for a term paper or something like that. But in terms of some kind of creative writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, I think somebody has to find their own voice and their own style. There isn't one style that fits all. So, there are certain things that I think you need in a book, in a memoir. You need to have a beginning, middle, and end. I think there has to be some kind of what some writers call movement toward wisdom, some kind of growth in terms of the protagonist or the main character. But how one does that, I think we each have to find our own way. So I think my job as a facilitator is to create a safe space so people feel like they're generally being supportive, and to give them tools and techniques that they can use. And I will give people constructive criticism and say, well, here are some things I think are working. Here are some things that you could work on. But I try to make it clear that it's always about the writing and not the writer, not the individual and their worth, because it can be difficult in, say, the workshopping process for people to hear feedback when it's kind of their life on the page. If we're talking about a fictional story, it's easier, I think, for the writer to say, okay, well, this is a story. So if you have some judgment about this character, you say she's not sympathetic, she doesn't seem realistic, it's a story. But if we say that that the protagonist doesn't feel sympathetic or realistic, or we don't understand why she made those decisions or something, someone can take it very personally. So one of the things I try to do in my classes is to make it clear that we're talking about the character on the page, which is a version of, say, the writer, but is not the same as the Lucy who is sitting in the room with us. We're talking about the Lucy on the page. And that helps, I think it helps the writer be able to hear some of that feedback, talking about what's working in the writing and what's not working. So I think that if people feel relatively safe, then they can do their best work. And I get a lot of satisfaction out of helping people tell their stories. But they really have to, each person has to find their voice. And I hope to facilitate that process, but it's not something I can really do for them.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of viewing what you do. And I will also note you must be really good at it, because although I haven't taken one of your classes, we connected through one of your students who said it was just a tremendous experience to work with you. So I can vouch for that.
It's been nice in the last, because now I've been teaching for about I've been teaching memoir writing and nonfiction for about 20 years. And in the last few years, I've been getting a lot of repeat students who take several classes with me. And to me, that's, an indication that folks are engaged. And that's, it's very gratifying. I really enjoy it.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Okay, we're out of time, but I really want to ask you one more thing, because I loved how you spoke about this before. When I asked you who inspires you, you told me about your sister's, your sister's mother-in-law who lives around here in Ipswich.
My sister-in-law's mother.
Okay, thank you. I mixed that up. Okay, so tell me, why does she inspire you?
She inspires me because she's somebody who is, now she's in her early 80s, I think, but she's always trying something new. So to me, she's kind of a model of healthy aging. She went back to graduate school. She had been a high school teacher. She taught English and I think German for about 25 years. And she also was on the whole internet thing back in the mid 90s, before I really knew what the internet was. She used it with her students. And then she decided that she wanted to try something different. So she went to graduate school at Simmons and got a job at a community college when she was about 65. And then she did that for a while. Then she got a job at a private school. Then just before COVID, she was doing the Airbnb. She became an Airbnb host, and she would get visitors from all over. This is, before COVID, people visiting from Europe and, basically all over the world. So she's inspiring to me because I don't think of her as being old, because again, she's somebody who is curious about the world and open to new things. And I guess that is what I'm hoping to continue, rather than be like, okay, well, I'm in my 60s, so I can't try anything new. It just, to me, she's kind of a symbol of being open. And I think that those are people I admire, particularly as, they and I get older.
Sounds like a really cool lady. I love it.
It really is.
Okay. Before I let us go, I have one very simple question for you from the audience, which is, where do you teach and how can we take a class with you?
Great question. So I've been teaching at Grub Street, which is a writing center for adults based in Boston. In fact, they have a new headquarters in the Seaport, and I think they're going to start having courses there, I think full-time in January, but they may be offering a few things in the fall. And over the last year and a half, I've been teaching for them on Zoom. So folks can go to Grub Street, which is GRUB Street, one word, .org. And they have just a whole range of classes in all kinds of genres. Again, I teach memoir and nonfiction, but they also have classes in poetry, novels, a short story, basically everything. I also teach classes for local libraries. I'm going to be teaching a class at Medford Public Library in the fall, also on Zoom. And folks could contact Medford Library if they want information about that. That class will be free, so that's a benefit. And then I'm also teaching some courses for Literary Cleveland, which is another nonprofit writing center, and they're also offering classes online, and people can go to I think it's litcleveland.org, or just Google Literary Cleveland, and that information will come up as well.
That's great. We will make sure that everybody after this receives links to your shows, your books, some of your classes. So that's great. Thank you, Judah. It's amazing to me how quickly this time flies by. But thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And if all of you out there have enjoyed what you've seen just now, please remember that JArts only exists because of generous people and donations from people like you. So if you like what you're seeing, please consider making a gift. And again, we'll send you all the links to Judah's works. There's some in the chat right now as well. And thanks. Have a great afternoon. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Thanks very much.